What's up guys, I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain. Today we're going to be showing you how to inspect and rebuild a fuel pump on an ATV. The fuel pump is a key component for your ATV to be running correctly. Now, some symptoms of a bad fuel pump would be maybe your ATV has poor acceleration or doesn't rev out from mid to high RPM, or maybe the machine doesn't start at all. So that's why we're going to be showing you how to diagnose your fuel pump first, and then if it doesn't work right, we're going to show you how to rebuild it. We're working on this Polaris Sportsman 570, but the process will be similar for just about any fuel-injected ATV. But whatever machine you're working on, you want to refer to your model-specific service manual because your fuel pump might be located in a different location than ours. So keep those things in mind, but with all that being said, let's get started. As far as parts go, we have a few different options on our website. So you can get the complete fuel pump assembly, or you can get a rebuild kit. And we have OEM and aftermarket options. So you might want to look through those, but today we're going to be installing this aftermarket rebuild kit. As far as the tools go to get this done, they are going to vary a little bit from machine to machine, but basically you're going to need some common hand tools, and that includes a plastic rivet removal tool. And then some of the specific stuff to get the job done are you're going to need a tool for the cap on the fuel pump. Now we're just using some large oil filter pliers, but sometimes they do make a special tool for that. And then depending if you're going to rebuild the pump or not, you may need a soldering iron and some crimping pliers. Now to test this stuff, there's a couple different tests we're going to show you. And you know, this fuel line, this test is going to let you know if you have some serious issues going on with your pump. But if you really want to know what's going on, you're also going to need a fuel pressure gauge. And then we're also going to be using a digital multimeter or a test light. And anytime you're dealing with fuel, you know, this stuff is under pressure, so you want to make sure you're wearing safety glasses and you have some rubber gloves on. Now we're going to cycle the key and listen for the fuel pump to turn on. You should hear a soft buzzing sound for about 3 seconds, then it should stop. If you didn't hear that buzzing sound, then the pump isn't working, and we're going to show you how to make sure the power is going down to it in a later step. So our fuel pump did cycle. We know we are getting power down to it and the motor is actually working, but it doesn't mean we have the correct pressure in the fuel system. So we want to check that, and you know, to gain access to that fuel pump, it's going to look a little bit different from machine to machine, but basically we're just going to remove the body panels until we have access to it. And if you own an ATV, you really need to get some of these plastic rivet removal tools. These make the job so much easier. Now that we have access to the fuel pump, we want to clean everything around it to make sure we don't get any dirt on the internal parts. Now that we have access to our fuel pump, you're going to want to refer to your model-specific service manual for these next few tests that we're going to be doing. But if some of you guys didn't have power or you didn't hear the fuel pump cycle when you turn the key on, what you're going to want to do is check for power at these terminals going into the fuel pump. So I'm actually going to disconnect this, and on these Polaris models, the 450s and 570s, It's going to be this red and blue wire and that brown one, terminals 3 and 4. We're going to use our meter to check for power across there and make sure we have a minimum of 7 volts. But typically you'll see around 12 volts. Now, since we aren't back probing, we need to be careful so we don't damage the connector with the meter leads. And when you cycle your key, the meter, it's going to have, between 7 and 12 volts for 3 seconds and then go back to 0 volts. Now, if you're not getting 7 volts down to the fuel pump, then you're going to want to look at your wiring harness and figure out why you're not getting power. Now, if you did have more than 7 volts coming down here, but the fuel pump, you don't hear it cycle, then what you're going to want to do, just to verify that the fuel pump is bad, you can do a continuity test between terminals 3 and 4 on the pump side of the harness. And if there's no continuity, then you know that fuel pump is bad. So we're going to reconnect this. Now we do want to do a fuel pressure test, but before we do that, I want to show you guys one test you can do even if you don't have a fuel pressure tester. So we're going to remove the cover for the fuel line and then we're going to disconnect it. So there's several different types of connectors. A lot of them, like this one, we have this blue cover. It's just going to pop up and we pull the line off. You want to cover that up with a rag and catch any fuel that might spill out. But there's other ones you actually have a rubber piece in there, you pull out on that and then you can remove or pull up on the connector and then pull this out. So just be aware of that. There's different styles and a couple of them you just squeeze and pull right off. So on that blue one, I was just pushing on the ends a little bit and using a screwdriver to pop it up. Cover it up with my rag and pull it off. So I'm going to take this 5/8 fuel line, stick that on the end of the pump, and then I'm going to use a ratio right to catch some fuel. And I'm going to cycle the key. And the main thing we're looking for here is good fuel flow. So if the fuel just kind of drizzles out of here, then you know the fuel filters in the pump are clogged up and you need to go in there and make some repairs. Now, one thing to be aware of, if you already did your fuel pressure test, you can have the correct fuel pressure but not have enough fuel flow. Ideally, you want to do both tests. So I'm going to go ahead and cycle the key. So you can see we have a nice solid stream coming out. Some manuals will actually give you a spec on how much is actually supposed to come out. But again, we're just concerned about having a nice solid flow, which we have. Now, like we just mentioned, all of the connectors are going to be different from fuel pump to fuel pump. So make sure you're using the correct adapter for your gauge. But right now we're going to hook up our fuel pressure gauge. You need to make sure that your adapter is correctly clipped on. So we've got that on the pump. Then we're going to insert this other end into the fuel rail. And we're going to lock it in place. So once that's on there tight, locked into place, we can connect the gauge itself. So on this particular gauge, it actually just screws right into this adapter. Then from here, we're going to cycle the key, and before we run the machine, we're going to make sure that we don't have any leaks. So we had our pressure rise, and then as long as that pressure doesn't drop down, we know the check valve in the pump is good. So now we're going to start the machine and run it. And when we run it, we actually want to give it a little bit of throttle and make sure that the needle stays stable. If it doesn't, that means you have some pressure issues going on. So the spec on this machine is 58 PSI plus or minus 2, and it stayed right there when we gave it throttle, when we didn't give it throttle. So we know everything is working correctly with this pump. Now, when we shut the machine off, you can see the gauge drops a little bit, and that's fine. The main thing we're looking for, as long as it doesn't just keep dropping all the way down. And all that check valve in the pump does is it's keeping pressure, and it helps for a quicker startup the next time you go to start it. So we know our pump's good, but we do want to show you guys the process for the rebuild. So we're going to go ahead and continue with that. And the last thing I want to mention before we disconnect the fuel pressure gauge is we're going to relieve the pressure. So we have this hose coming out the end. We're just going to open that valve up and let that leak into a drain pan or ratio right. Then we can disconnect everything. So even though our fuel pressure is good, we're actually going to go in here and we're going to show you guys how to get this the fuel pump rebuilt. So to do that, we got to disconnect our electrical wires. And then we need to loosen up this cap. So there's actually a special tool to loosen this up, but for most people, you know, maybe you have an oil filter wrench laying around, that's going to do the job. And something to be aware of is you've got this triangle right here, or this mark in between the two notches on the tank. You know, not all machines are going to have that, but be aware of that. Make sure you get this thing tightened back up when you go to reinstall it. You know, and if you're using these, just make sure you have a secure grip on there, on those tabs. Now, before you take your fuel pump out, you got to keep in mind where your fuel level is out. You might have to siphon a little bit of fuel out of the tank. With the cap off, we can go ahead and remove the pump. So I'm going to pull up on this. Keep in mind, you might have to rotate this because we've got a sending unit and a fuel filter on the bottom. Now with the fuel pump at the bench, we want to make sure that we have all that fuel out of there so we don't spill it everywhere. So we're just using a drain pan to dump that into. Next thing we want to do is start disassembling this old pump. So with this, we're going to pop off the pickup screen first, and it's just pressed on. There's a small tab in here that has a spring washer on it. So we're just going to use a screwdriver to gently pry that off. You might have to work it from both sides. And just be aware of the sending unit. You want to make sure you don't damage that. The next thing we're going to do is disconnect our electrical connections. And you know, the positive is a different size than the negative, so we're not going to be able to mess those up. So to remove the pump, again, be aware of the sending unit. You don't want to mess that up. And we're just going to pop the fuel pump out from the side. So to do that, you'll notice there's two tabs on the side of this plastic housing. They need to move out, and then you can pull that pump out and then pull it up. So I'm just going to spread those with my fingers and pull out on that pump. Once it's there, you can pull straight up. That hose is just going to flex a little bit. Now to remove this fuel pump, we actually have to remove this fuel hose. Now this isn't typical. A lot of pumps, you're actually going to have an O-ring down here that seals that, and they just kind of pop into place. But you know, if you inspect the fuel hose on your pump and it's bad, or if you have one like ours, what you're going to have to do is use a razor blade. You're going to cut this hose, and then we're going to use a heat gun to install the new stuff. And when you're doing this, just be really careful. You don't want to damage this piece on top. So I'm barely cutting through. I might take another slice through just because I'm not all the way. The next thing we're going to do is replace our pressure relief valve. So on this machine, it's right in the top of this cap, but other machines, it's going to be further down on the body. So if it's further down and you've got this big plastic body, typically you're going to have this other style, and you've got some plastic clips you just pull out on to get that replaced. And sometimes these actually have a ground strap on them. So just be aware of that. But for this one, we're just going to pop this clip out. So to get the clip out, we're going to use this pick, and you might notice this one's grounded to it, has that bare wire right there. Then I'm going to use the needle nose pliers to remove that. Going to put a little silicone spray on that O-ring. It's going to help it go in a little bit easier. We'll make sure that pops down into place and reinstall that clip. And for the clip, be really careful when you do this, but I'm actually going to use a screwdriver to pop that into place. Now for the pump, we're going to remove the caps on both ends. And then this is going to sit in there just like that. So first thing I'm going to do is get this other hose on there. So this thing, there's no way it's going to go on just like that. So we have to heat this up with the heat gun. Now just remember, you don't want to melt that. You just want it to be warm enough to slide right on just like that. So we're going to do the same thing for the top now. So we probably could have got that just a little warmer, but that's on there pretty tight. So that's going to be good. And the other thing, you know, when I was sliding that on, I was paying attention to where those terminals are. You need to have this in the correct orientation. Now real quick, I want to talk about some of the other ATVs out there. So again, if it's not this style, what you're going to do, there's going to be some plastic tabs. You pry out on the plastic tabs and you're going to remove the filter. There's going to be an O-ring on top, and then replacement's really simple. Install the new O-ring on the new pump, slide it into place, and then once that's on there, you usually have another plastic cap on bottom, and then you'll install the pickup screen. So now we're going to take the pump and we'll just slide it into place past that retainer. And then it's going to sit like that until we pop it into place because of those two tabs. So I'm going to press down on this a little further and then press in on those tabs until it pops into place. Next, we're going to hook up the ground wire. And then we have the positive wire. Make sure those are clipped on there solid, so those ones aren't going anywhere. Now, it's something to be aware of. Sometimes when you replace these fuel hoses, these wires are actually zip tied to them. So if that's the case, your kit is going to come with a new zip tie. So make sure you get that zip tie back in place. Next thing we're going to do is clean that sealing surface on the top of the pump. And then sometimes the rebuild kits come with the new gaskets. Sometimes they don't, but it's always recommended to install a new O-ring or gasket right there. So once that's in place, we're ready to install the pickup screen. Now, you know, a lot of these kits, they'll come with multiple pickup screens. And one thing I do want to point out is, for some reason, this kit, this is flip-flopped. And if we install it the way it has to go on the pump, it's not going to work because our tank ends right there. So we're going to install this option on there. You know, this option, we can almost install it in any direction we need that's going to work. But we've looked at our gas tank and it looks like if we install it just like this, it's going to work great. Now for the pickup screen, you need to make sure that, you know, the base of that is bottomed out against the new fuel pump. and that it's all the way on. Now, some of these, they have that star washer built into them. So once you press down, that thing is on there solid and it's not going to go anywhere. But some of them don't have it built in. So if this little star washer is separate, make sure you get that pressed on. One thing you can do is use a little bit of grease on the end of a socket. You'll pick that up with the socket, and then you can use this to just press down on that little tab. Now, one more thing we're going to do while we're in here is test the sending unit and make sure that is working properly. So to do that, we tested terminals 3 and 4 before. We're going to test from terminals 1 and 2. And those are going to be our sending unit wires. In other words, the wires that send signal to the fuel gauge on our dash. So we've back probed those wires, and we just have our meter on the ohm setting. We're going to start with this all the way at the bottom. So, when this thing's empty, you have the most ohms. So we're at 451 ohms. We're going to slowly move this float up, and you're going to want to watch for the transition to be pretty smooth. If you have any spots where this just drops out, then you know it's bad. But you just want it to count continuously down from 451. Now that we're all the way at the top, we're seeing 100 ohms. Now, the specs might vary from machine to machine, but the main thing you need to keep in mind, you're just checking for a smooth transition all the way from one end of the spectrum to the other. So if you're moving this up and maybe you're at 300 ohms, then all of a sudden it goes to 0 ohms for a second and then goes back up to whatever, 250, you have dropouts like that, then you have issues. The other issue you might have is it just doesn't read anything at all the whole time. So if anything like that's going on, you need to get that replaced. Back over at the machine, we're going to install our rebuilt fuel pump assembly, and we're just going to snake this in. And just make sure you have the same orientation on the pump as when you took this out. So for us, we had, that fuel line's going to be coming out on the right side. So you'll notice we also have this line on the top of the pump assembly, and it's going in between the two lines on the tank. And then we're going to take our cap. We're going to make sure that gasket's set or seated all the way on the right position, and then install the cap. So sometimes you're going to get a torque spec with these caps, but the main thing we're making sure is the cap is back in its original position. And with that, you want to make sure this is on correctly, because any fuel coming out of here could cause a potential fire hazard. So just be really cautious with this. After that, we can reconnect our wires. Then from here, we're going to reinstall the fuel line. Make sure that's pressed all the way on. And then we're going to press the clip on. Make sure that's not going to come off. And before we continue, I'm going to cycle the key and make sure we don't have any leaks. And it's not a bad idea to make sure it starts. Our connections are looking good and everything works, so we're going to go ahead with reassembly. That's everything you need to know to get your fuel pump diagnosed and rebuilt on your ATV. If you need any of the parts we used today, maybe you need a rebuild kit or a complete fuel pump module, you can find those on our website. Again, we have both OEM and aftermarket parts. And if you want to see more helpful content like this, subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.